The world is a stage where the most powerful actors often hide in the plainest of costumes, and Min-Hee was a master of this invisible art. To the high society circles of the city, she was merely a background figure, a silent ornament in the life of her ambitious husband, Tae-Jun. But every legend has a hidden foundation, a root system that goes deeper than anyone dares to imagine. Min-Hee was the sole heir to Vanguard Global, a multi-trillion-dollar conglomerate that functioned as the central nervous system of the nation's economy. Her grandfather, a man who had built empires out of dust and iron, had raised her with a singular philosophy: true power does not demand to be seen, it demands to be felt when it is gone. When Min-Hee met Tae-Jun, he was a man with a hungry gaze and nothing in his pockets but a dream of greatness. She loved that hunger, mistaking it for passion. She chose to embark on a radical experiment of the heart. She would hide her wealth, her name, and her immense influence. She would live as a simple woman, a common housewife, to see if Tae-Jun would love her for the soul she possessed rather than the bank accounts she controlled. For 10 years, she played this role with the dedication of a saint. She became the woman who cooked, the woman who cleaned, and the woman who whispered encouragement in the dark when his confidence wavered. She was the secret architect of his every success, using her hidden connections to smooth his path, all while he believed he was a self-made titan. It was a 10-year test of loyalty, a gamble where the prize was her life's devotion, and the penalty for failure was total destruction. The evening of their 10th wedding anniversary began with a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to seep through the very walls of the mansion. Outside, the sky was a bruised canvas of deep purples and violent grays, as a massive storm system rolled in from the coast, mirroring the atmospheric pressure building inside the house. Min-Hee stood in the center of the kitchen, a space that had become her sanctuary and her prison over the last decade. The room was a marvel of modern design, white marble, stainless steel, and soft ambient lighting, but tonight it felt like a cold, sterile laboratory where she was observing the final moments of a dying experiment. She was wearing a simple, faded cotton apron over a dress she had bought at a local market years ago. Her hair, which was naturally thick and lustrous, was pulled back into a tight, practical bun, secured by a cheap plastic clip. She looked like a woman who had given up on herself, which was exactly the mask she needed Tae-Jun to see. Her hands, however, moved with a grace and speed that betrayed a high level of intelligence and focus. She was preparing a 12-course traditional meal, a feast that required a level of culinary mastery few possessed. On the stove, the galbi-jjim had been simmering for over 6 hours, the meat slowly absorbing the complex flavors of aged soy sauce, hand-pressed pear juice, and a secret blend of medicinal herbs her grandfather had favored. The aroma was intoxicating, a rich, savory scent that spoke of home, warmth, and a decade of shared history. She moved to the counter, where she began the delicate process of plating the japchae. Each strand of glass noodle was perfectly translucent, tossed with vibrant, julienne vegetables that she had sliced with the precision of a diamond cutter. To a casual observer, she was just a wife cooking dinner. To Min-Hee, each ingredient was a memory, a year of her life she had invested in a man who was currently at a high-end bar, celebrating a freedom he hadn't yet earned. As she worked, her mind drifted back to their early days. She remembered the tiny, one-room flat they had shared in the beginning. There was no heating, and during the winter, they would huddle together under a single thin blanket, their breath blooming in the cold air like small, hopeful ghosts. Tae-Jun would hold her hands and swear that one day, he would put a diamond on every finger and build her a castle. Min-Hee had smiled then, knowing she already owned the castles, but wanting only the man. She had used her secret influence to get him his first major contract, then his second, then his third. She had watched him grow from a nervous intern into a confident executive, then into the CEO of MJ Group, a subsidiary she had allowed him to found using her family's seed money. She had been the wind beneath his wings, and now, he had begun to believe he was the one who had taught the wind how to blow. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck 7, the deep, resonant chimes echoing through the empty house. Tae-Jun was late. He was always late now. For the past year, he had stopped pretending to care about the simple life they shared. He stayed out late, he smelled of perfumes that cost more than Min-Hee's entire wardrobe, and he looked at her with a growing sense of irritation, as if her very presence was a reminder of a past he wanted to bury. Min-Hee knew about the mistress, a young, ambitious social climber named Ji-Soo who thought she had captured a king. She knew about the secret bank accounts Tae-Jun had opened to hide the money he was embezzling from the MJ group. She knew everything, because in her world, information was the only currency that never devalued. At exactly 7:45 p.m., the front door's electronic lock chirped, a sharp, digital sound that signaled the end of the piece. Tae-Jun entered the foyer, his movements sharp and aggressive. He didn't call out her name. He didn't apologize for the time. He simply dropped his briefcase on the floor and walked straight to the bar in the living room. Min-Hee stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're late, Tae-Jun. I made your favorite. The anniversary meal is ready," she said, her voice soft, carefully maintaining the submissive tone she had used for 10 years. Tae-Jun didn't look at her. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the ice clinking against the glass with a sound like breaking teeth. He took a long, deep swallow before finally turning to face her. His eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth that had once made her believe in him. He looked at her apron, her simple bun, and the faint smudge of flour on her cheek with a visceral sense of disgust. "An anniversary meal? Do you really think I care about that, Minhi? Look at you. You look like a servant. You smell like a kitchen. I spend my days with people who are shaping the future of this country, and then I come home to this. A woman who thinks a bowl of soup can fix a stagnant life," he sneered, his voice dripping with a newfound, lethal arrogance. He walked to the dining table, but he didn't sit down. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick, white envelope. He tossed it onto the table, right next to the $500 bottle of wine Min-Hee had opened. The envelope hit the table with a dull thud, knocking over a crystal vase. The water spilled out, soaking the white lace tablecloth, a cloth Min-Hee had hand-embroidered during the first year of their marriage. "Sign it. I've already had my legal team finalize everything. You get the house in the suburbs and a monthly stipend that will keep you in all the flour and vegetables you need. It's more than you deserve, considering you've done nothing but sit here and spend my money for a decade," he said, his voice as flat as a tombstone. Min-Hee looked at the water spreading across the lace, watching it drown the small, unlit candle on the anniversary cake. She felt a strange sensation, not the sharp sting of a broken heart, but the cold, heavy realization that the experiment was over. The subject had failed. "You're divorcing me?" "On our 10th anniversary," she asked, her voice steady, lacking the tremor of a victim. "Don't act so surprised. You've been a weight around my neck for years. I need a woman who can stand beside me at the Blue House, a woman who understands the language of power, not someone whose greatest achievement is a perfectly cooked rib," Tae-Jun barked. He pulled out his phone, and a photo of Ji-Soo flashed on the screen. The girl was wearing a ruby necklace that Tae-Jun had bought using the MJ Group's emergency fund. "I built this empire, Min-Hee. I am the king of this city. And a king needs a queen, not a maid. Now sign the papers and be gone by morning. I've already invited my new guests to move in tomorrow afternoon." He turned his back on her, walking toward the stairs with the swagger of a man who thought he had just won the final hand of a high-stakes poker game. He didn't see the way Min-Hee's eyes changed. The softness vanished, replaced by a dark, ancient intelligence. She didn't pick up the pen to sign. Instead, she picked up her phone and sent a single, 3-word message to a number that hadn't been dialed in 10 years. "The winter begins." Min-Hee stood frozen in the middle of the darkened dining room, the only sound being the rhythmic, heavy ticking of the grandfather clock that seemed to be counting down the final seconds of her old life. The air in the mansion, which had always felt slightly cold, was now frigid, as if the house itself recognized that its true heart was about to stop beating. She looked down at the divorce papers resting on the damp lace tablecloth. The white paper glowed under the dim chandelier light, looking like a sharp, jagged bone. For 10 long years, she had been the silent architect of this home, the invisible force that turned a house into a sanctuary, and now, with a single flick of a pen, Tae-Jun had attempted to erase her existence. She felt a strange, crystalline clarity wash over her. It wasn't the heat of anger or the sting of sorrow. It was the cold, absolute resolve of a woman who had finally seen the bottom of a shallow man's soul. Slowly, Min-Hee reached for the strings of her faded cotton apron. Her fingers, which had spent the last decade peeling vegetables and scrubbing floors to maintain the illusion of a simple life, were steady and precise. She untied the knot at the small of her back, the fabric slipping from her shoulders and falling to the marble floor with a soft, final thud. It was the sound of a prisoner dropping her chains. She stood there in her simple market dress, looking at the feast she had prepared, the braised ribs, the vibrant glass noodles, the anniversary cake, and she realized that every ounce of her devotion had been cast before a man who saw kindness as a weakness to be exploited. With a deliberate, slow movement, she swept her arm across the table. The crystal vase shattered, the water spilling like a final tear, and the anniversary cake tumbled to the floor, a broken ruin of sugar and misplaced hope. She turned away from the wreckage and walked toward the laundry room, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous hallway that Tae-Jun had filled with expensive, soulless art. Behind the heavy industrial dryer, hidden in a secret compartment built into the wainscoting that only she knew about, sat a black titanium briefcase. It was cold to the touch and heavy with the weight of her true heritage. She pulled it out and set it on the washing machine, the metallic click of the lock sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. Inside was the Vanguard emergency protocol, a satellite phone, a set of encrypted hardware keys, and a black titanium credit card that had no name and no limit. She turned on the phone, and the screen's blue glow illuminated her face, revealing the sharp, intelligent features of the woman who had once been the most brilliant mind at Vanguard Global. The phone vibrated instantly, a frantic cascade of red notifications lighting up the dark room. Director Kong, the man who had been the silent guardian of the Vanguard family for 4 decades, had been waiting for this exact signal for 3,650 days. She pressed the icon for a secure video call. On the first ring, a man in an impeccably tailored suit appeared, his eyes widening with a mixture of shock and profound relief. "Chairwoman," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Is it time? Has the bird finally left the cage?" Min-Hee looked at her reflection in the darkened window of the laundry room. "The bird is gone, Kong. The cage is empty. Initiate Protocol Phoenix. I want Tae-Jun's world dismantled brick by brick, but do not strike until I am in the room to watch the lights go out." She walked out of the mansion's front gates just as the storm reached its peak. The rain was a torrential wall of water, the wind screaming through the trees like a wounded animal. She didn't have a suitcase, she didn't need anything from that house of lies. Waiting at the curb was a fleet of 3 black, armored sedans, their engines humming with a low, predatory growl. Director Kong stood in the middle of the downpour, holding a large black umbrella with the posture of a palace guard. As Min-Hee approached, he didn't just greet her, he bowed so deeply that his forehead was nearly level with the car door, a sign of absolute, ancestral loyalty that Tae-Jun could never command. "Welcome home, Chairwoman," Kong said, his voice steady against the roar of the wind. "The world has been much darker without your light." As the motorcade moved through the city toward the Grand Hyatt, Min-Hee sat in the back of the lead car, her fingers flying across a tablet. She watched the real-time data of MJ Group, the company Tae-Jun thought he owned. She saw the secret offshore accounts he used to fund his mistress's lifestyle, the embezzled funds from the employee pension plan, and the fraudulent contracts he had signed with rival conglomerates. He was a small man playing a big game, unaware that the person who had been cooking his breakfast for 10 years was the person who owned the bank that held his debt. "He thinks he's a king, Kong," she said, her voice dropping to a cold, melodic whisper. "He truly believes he built this empire on his own. I want him to understand that every cent he ever touched was a gift from the woman he called boring. When they arrived at the hotel, they bypassed the lobby entirely, taking a private elevator to the presidential suite on the 100th floor. Waiting for her was a team of the world's most elite image strategists, forensic accountants, and international lawyers. For the next 6 hours, Min-Hee underwent a transformation that was less about fashion and more about reclaiming her throne. Her long, dull hair was shorn into a sharp, lethal bob that emphasized her high cheekbones and flint-like eyes. Her skin was treated with rare minerals until it radiated a glass skin glow that signaled immense, untouchable wealth. She stepped into a bespoke charcoal gray power suit made of a fabric so rare it was only woven once every 10 years. As she looked at herself in the mirror at 4 a.m., the housewife was gone. In her place stood the most powerful woman in the hemisphere, ready to walk into the MJ Group boardroom and watch her husband's world turn to ash. The morning sun hit the glass exterior of the MJ Group headquarters with a blinding brilliance, but inside the executive boardroom on the 88th floor, the air was heavy with a stagnant, suffocating tension. Tae-Jun sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, his posture radiating a predatory confidence. He was dressed in a navy blue Italian suit that cost more than a common worker's yearly salary, and in his right hand, he swirled a glass of vintage scotch, the amber liquid catching the light as he laughed. He was surrounded by his inner circle, 12 directors who had long ago traded their ethics for a seat at the table of Tae-Jun's perceived power. They were in the middle of a grand celebration, a toast to the final destruction of the company's legacy in favor of a quick, billion-dollar sell-off. Gentlemen, Tae-Jun's voice boomed, echoing off the soundproof walls with a hollow, metallic resonance. Today, we don't just sign a contract. Today, we liberate the MJ Group from the ghost of its founder. We sell the research division, we liquidate the old assets, and we focus on the only thing that matters in this world, raw, liquid profit. He paused, a cruel, satisfied smirk crossing his face as he looked around at the nodding heads. And let us not forget the personal victory of last night. I have finally removed the anchor that was dragging me down. My simple, pathetic wife is gone. I threw the divorce papers in her face while she was busy crying over a bowl of soup. A man of my stature needs a partner who understands the scent of power, not a housewife who smells like detergent and failure. The directors joined in his laughter, a chorus of sycophants who believed they were untouchable, unaware that the foundation of the room was already turning to dust. The laughter was cut short not by a word, but by a sound that made everyone's blood run cold. It was the sound of the boardroom's reinforced double doors being struck with a force so absolute it seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of their bones. The doors swung open with a violent crash, and the silence that followed was terrifying. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a vacuum of power. Tae-Jun didn't even look up at first, his ego still fueling his misplaced anger. I explicitly stated no interruptions. Security, find out who that is and have them dragged out of this building immediately, he roared, his voice cracking with an unexplained tremor. But security didn't come. Instead, the rhythmic, mechanical click of stiletto heels began to fill the room, a sharp, lethal sound that sounded like a firing squad preparing for execution. Tae-Jun slowly raised his head, and the glass of scotch slipped from his fingers, shattering on the white marble floor in a spray of amber liquid and jagged crystal. Standing at the end of the long table was a woman who looked like she had been carved out of midnight and starlight. Her hair was a sharp, asymmetrical bob, as black as obsidian and just as sharp. She wore a bespoke charcoal gray power suit that fit her like a second skin, radiating an aura of authority so ancient and absolute it made the directors gasp. Tae-Jun's brain struggled to process the image. The woman standing there had the same eyes as Min-Hee, but the warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline intelligence that seemed to dissect his soul with a single glance. Min-Hee, he stuttered, his voice losing every ounce of its faked authority. What is this ridiculous costume? How did you get in here? This is a board meeting for the elite, not a place for a housewife to play dress up. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He expected the directors to shout, to call for help, but instead, they did something that made his world stop turning. In a single, fluid motion, all 12 directors stood up and bowed so deeply their foreheads nearly touched the mahogany table. Chairwoman Min-Hee, they whispered in a unified, trembling chorus. We have been awaiting your command. Min-Hee didn't look at them, her eyes were fixed on Tae-Jun. She walked toward the head of the table, each step a declaration of war. The only person playing dress up here, Tae-Jun, is you, she said, her voice low, resonant, and carrying the weight of a decade of silent observation. You sat in my grandfather's chair, using my family's money to buy your suits and your mistresses, truly believing you were the king of this empire. You thought I was a shadow because I chose to stand behind you, never realizing that without me, you have no light. She reached the head of the table and leaned over, her face inches from his. I gave you 10 years to prove you were more than a greedy, shallow thief. Last night, you gave me your final answer. The test is over, and you have failed. She snapped her fingers, and the massive digital display behind her flickered to life. It didn't show the fraudulent market projections Tae-Jun had spent months faking. Instead, it showed a devastating, high-definition timeline of his absolute ruin, the illegal transfers to offshore accounts in Macau, the wiretapped recordings of his secret meetings with corporate rivals, and the GPS logs of every hotel he had visited with his mistress. The room went cold as the directors realized that Minhi hadn't just been watching Tae-Jun, she had been watching them too. She pulled the black leather folder from her suit, the same papers he had thrown at her, and tossed them onto his chest. I've signed the divorce, Tae-Jun. But I've also filed a criminal injunction that freezes every single asset linked to your name. Your penthouse, your cars, the very shoes on your feet, they all belong to the Vanguard Trust now. You walked into this room as a CEO, but you are leaving it as a man with nothing. As the sirens began to wail from the street below, Min-Hee sat in the chair at the head of the table. Security, escort this man out of my building. He is no longer part of our future. The descent of Tae-Jun from the gilded heights of the 88th floor to the rain-slicked, unforgiving pavement of the city streets was not merely a fall from grace, it was a public execution of his entire identity. As the heavy, cold metal of the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the sound resonated through the silent, frozen boardroom like a gavel announcing a final, irreversible judgment. Tae-Jun looked down at his hands, those same hands that had signed away a decade of Min-Hee's devotion, and saw them trembling like dry leaves caught in the first frost of winter. Two officers, their faces as expressionless as carved granite, gripped his arms with a clinical strength and began to lead him out. He tried to resist, his voice cracking as he shouted about his rights and his stature, but to the world, he was no longer a titan of industry. He was simply a common embezzler caught in the glare of a much brighter light. The walk through the MJ Group lobby was a gauntlet of fire and shame. Min-Hee's team had ensured that the Night of Long Knives would be televised to every corner of the nation. As the elevator doors chimed and opened on the ground floor, a blinding, chaotic wall of camera flashes erupted, a staccato rhythm of artificial lightning that stripped away what little dignity he had left. Hundreds of employees, people he had belittled, ignored, and stepped over for years, stood in a silent, living corridor, watching him pass with a cold, satisfied curiosity. There was no pity in that lobby, only a visceral sense of justice. The press swarmed him like vultures over a fresh carcass, their microphones thrust toward his face like jagged spears. Tae-Jun, did you use the employee pension funds for your gambling debts? How long were you planning to betray your wife while she built your empire? The questions were a barrage he couldn't deflect. He was shoved into the back of a police cruiser, the cold, cracked leather seat smelling of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, a far cry from the sandalwood and luxury of the repossessed limousine he had arrived in. While Tae-Jun was being processed in a cold, fluorescent-lit precinct, Min-Hee was back in the boardroom, orchestrating a surgical purging of the company's remaining corruption. She sat in her grandfather's chair, her silhouette framed by the panoramic view of a city that was finally beginning to understand who held the real power. One by one, the directors who had collaborated with Tae-Jun were summoned to her office. They entered with arrogant excuses and well-rehearsed lies, but they left in tears, their careers ended by a single, sharp stroke of Min-Hee's pen. She didn't need to raise her voice, her calm, lethal whispers carried more weight than any shout ever could. You traded your loyalty for a man who didn't even know your children's names, she told them, her eyes as unyielding as a frozen lake. By the time the clock struck midnight, she had dismantled the entire network of traitors, replacing them with the brilliant, suppressed minds who had been waiting for a leader worth following. The true weight of his betrayal, however, didn't hit Tae-Jun until he was released on a temporary, restrictive bail several hours later. Standing on the sidewalk in the pouring rain, his passport seized and his bank accounts frozen into useless digital blocks, he reached for his phone, the only thing he still had. With shaking fingers, he called Ji-Soo, the young model who had been the catalyst for his final mistake. He believed, in his desperate delusion, that she would be his sanctuary. The call connected after a dozen rings, but the voice that answered was a stranger to him. The sweetness was gone, replaced by a jagged, visceral edge of disgust. "Why are you calling me, Tae-Jun?" she snapped. "I don't date criminals, especially ones who are bankrupt. I've already moved my things out of the penthouse." "It's funny, actually, Min-Hee's lawyers offered me a very generous deal to testify about the gifts you bought with company money. I took the deal. Don't call me again. You're not a man to me anymore, you're just a toxic liability I've already forgotten." The line went dead, the dial tone sounding like a final, mocking laugh against the roar of the city traffic. Tae-Jun stood there, his designer shoes soaked through and his hair plastered to his forehead, realizing that every person he had bought with Min-Hee's money had vanished the moment the gold stopped flowing. He was alone in a city that now knew him only as a thief. He began to walk, his feet aching in his ruined shoes, eventually finding himself in front of the tiny, one-room apartment in the old district where they had started 10 years ago. Min-Hee had kept the rent paid all these years, a final, poetic irony. As he climbed the creaking stairs and sat on the cold linoleum floor in the dark, he finally understood. He hadn't just lost a company, he had lost the only person in the world who would have loved him even if he had been the ghost he had now become. 1 full year had passed since the night the glass shattered in the MJ Group boardroom, a year that the national media had come to call the era of the Iron Phoenix. The city's skyline, once a symbol of Tae-Jun's hollow vanity, had been transformed under a new kind of leadership. Min-Hee now sat in an office that felt like a cathedral of light and glass, a stark, breathtaking contrast to the dark, oppressive wood-paneled dungeon her husband had once occupied. The heavy mahogany table, a relic of toxic ego, was gone, replaced by a vast, circular desk of sustainable crystal that reflected the open sky. From this height, she looked out over a metropolis that no longer saw her as a domestic ghost, but as the most visionary CEO in the history of the continent. Under her guidance, the MJ Group hadn't just survived, it had evolved into a global titan of ethical technology and green energy, proving that a company could be both immensely profitable and fundamentally human. Min-Hee's daily life was now a vibrant, high-stakes tapestry of power and purpose. She no longer spent her mornings scrubbing the stains of another person's neglect or her evenings waiting for the sound of a key that brought only coldness. Her hands, once smelling of kitchen spices and harsh detergents, now signed international treaties and multi-billion-dollar initiatives that changed the lives of millions. She was surrounded by a new generation of leaders, brilliant, hungry minds who had been suppressed during Tae-Jun's reign of mediocrity. She had discovered that her true talent wasn't just in managing wealth, but in recognizing the spark of potential in others, a spark she had once almost allowed to be extinguished in herself. She was finally living the saga her grandfather had intended, a life where her intellect was her greatest weapon and her integrity was her unbreakable shield. On a cold, rain-drenched afternoon that felt like a deliberate mirror of the day she was betrayed, Min-Hee stepped out of her headquarters, her charcoal silk coat flowing behind her with a commanding grace. She dismissed her security detail at the entrance of a quiet, forgotten park in the old district, near the tiny apartment she had once shared with Tae-Jun. As she walked through the mist, her heels clicking against the wet stone with a rhythmic confidence, she noticed a figure sitting on a rusted, peeling bench. It was a man whose clothes were several sizes too large for his shrunken frame, his hair a messy, unkempt gray that made him look 20 years older than his actual age. It was Tae-Jun. He was clutching a discarded, waterlogged business magazine, his eyes fixed on the cover. He didn't see her at first. He was staring at the image of Min-Hee on the cover with a mixture of religious worship and agonizing despair. He had spent the last year moving through a revolving door of courtrooms and low-rent holding cells, his name a permanent punchline in every tabloid in the country. He was working as a manual laborer at a nearby construction site, his hands, once soft from a luxury he never earned, now raw, blistered, and shaking from the cold. When he finally looked up and saw her standing there, he didn't shout, he didn't beg, and he didn't try to explain. He simply froze. The gap between them was no longer just a few feet of park pavement, it was a vast, unbridgeable canyon of character and soul. He saw the woman he had called simple and useless, and he realized that she was a son he had been lucky enough to stand near, but too small to ever truly understand. Min-Hee didn't say a single word. She didn't need to. There was no anger left in her, only a profound, quiet indifference that was more devastating than any insult. She looked through him as if he were a ghost of a dream she had long ago outgrown. She turned and walked toward her waiting car, her steps light and her heart entirely at peace. Her revenge was absolute, not because she had taken his money, but because she had reclaimed her own light and left him in the darkness he had created for himself. As her motorcade pulled away into the neon glow of the city's future, Tae-Jun was left behind in the rain, holding a damp piece of paper with her face on it, finally understanding the ultimate truth. He hadn't just lost a fortune, he had lost the only heart in the world that would have loved him even if he had stayed the nobody he had finally become. The story of Min-Hee and the fall of the house of Tae-Jun is more than just a tale of corporate revenge. It is a powerful reminder that silence is not a lack of strength, and kindness is never a lack of power. For 10 years, she played the role of a shadow to protect the fragile ego of a man who didn't deserve her, only to find that true love and true leadership do not require you to diminish your own light. Her journey from the kitchen to the throne is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the inevitable justice that awaits those who trade their integrity for a hollow crown. Min-Hee didn't just reclaim a company, she reclaimed her soul. She stands today as a beacon for every person who has been underestimated or betrayed, proving that your value is not determined by how someone treats you, but by the fire you carry within. Thank you for walking this emotional journey of redemption and justice with us today. Min-Hee's victory is a testament to the fact that the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deep it is buried. If this story touched your heart or inspired you to stand taller, please give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Min-Hee should have given Tae-Jun one last chance, or was his total ruin the only fair ending? We read every single comment. Don't forget to subscribe to K-Saga Stories and hit the notification bell so you never miss another chapter of our most powerful, heart-pounding sagas. Your support helps us tell the stories that need to be told. See you in the next chapter.